Today's scripture reading is Joshua 3, verses 1 through 7 and 14 through 17. Early in the morning, Joshua rose and set out from Shittim with all the Israelites, and they came to Jordan. They camped there before crossing over. At the end of 3 days, the officers went through the camp and commanded the people, "When you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord, your God, being carried by the Levitical priest, then you shall set out from your place. Follow it, so that you may know the way you should go, for you have not passed this way before. Yet there shall be a space between you and it, a distance of about 2,000 cubits. Do not come any nearer to it." Then Joshua said to the people, "Sanctify yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you." To the priest Joshua said, "Take up the ark of the covenant and pass on in front of the people." So they took up the ark of the covenant and went in front of the people. The Lord said to Joshua, "This day I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all of Israel, so that they may know that I will be with you as I was with Moses." When the people set out from their tents to cross over the Jordan, the priests bearing the ark of the covenant were in front of the people. Now the Jordan overflows its banks throughout the time of harvest. So those who bore the ark will come to the Jordan, and the feet of the priests bearing the ark were dipped in the edge of the water. The waters flowing from above stood still, rising up in a single heap off of at Adam, the city that is beside Zerah, while those flowing toward the sea of Arabah, the Dead Sea, were wholly cut off. Then the people crossed over opposite Jericho. While all of Israel were crossing over on dry ground, the priests who bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood firmly on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan until the entire nation finished crossing over Jordan. Holy be the reading of this word and the hearing of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. For those of us who have ever walked in someone else's shadow and have felt like we couldn't possibly measure up, today's scripture is for us. Maybe you have an older and accomplished sibling who you followed behind in school, and you can remember the teachers constantly comparing you. Perhaps you were an incredible athlete, same. And there was always someone who was just a little stronger, a little faster. Were you a theater kid who went out for the lead but got cast as the understudy? Today is for the younger siblings, the second strings, and the understudies. This morning we continue our series, What Jesus Learned in Saturday School, Lessons from the Hebrew Bible. Pastor Zigrid and I are sharing stories from the Old Testament, some of which are lesser known. And there is a lot of wisdom in these ancient texts. Such good wisdom, in fact, that it informed Jesus' life and ministry. These are the holy scriptures from which he learned as a young boy, and the very same that he would go on to reference in his teachings. Because the majority of the people in the ancient world could not read or write, these lessons would have been shared as readings from the Torah by rabbis in the synagogues, but not every community had a synagogue in which to gather, so scriptures in those cases would be taught through the sharing of stories and dramatic reenactments. We can imagine Jesus and his contemporaries listening to this thrilling tale of Joshua with wide eyes. There's a courageous leader, his gathered people, the Ark of the Covenant long before Steven Spielberg and Indiana Jones, the parting of waters, and after 40 years of trekking through the wilderness, the Israelites enter into the promised land at last. When hearing this, our faith ancestors would have quickly picked up on the comparison between Joshua and his predecessor, Moses. Once, at a vacation Bible school in a different church many years ago, a pastor was leading a lesson on Joshua. The pastor had only begun to introduce the story when a child yelled out, as children will do, "Who is this Joshua guy anyway?" And before the pastor could answer, another slightly older child who knew it all may have said, "He's the dude who followed Moses." Just the dude who followed Moses. Joshua, too often known as the understudy, but he was so much more than that. After Moses died, God instructed Joshua to follow in his footsteps, making him the new leader of the Israelites. God instructed him to take his people on the final leg of the journey into the promised land. To get there, Joshua must lead his people across a body of water. And when Jesus and others had heard Joshua's story, they would have immediately made the comparison to Moses crossing the Red Sea. But I'd like to zoom in really closely on a significant difference in these two stories. Flashback to the famous passage from Exodus 14 in which we hear Moses raised his hand over the Red Sea. Perhaps you've seen artwork that demonstrates this. And the Lord caused a strong wind to blow from the east, the sea split, and the wind made the ground dry. But in the book of Joshua, we hear, when feet of the priests bearing the ark were dipped in the edge of the waters flowing above stood still, rising up in a single heap. For Moses, the sea began to part when his hand raised, and God stirred up the water. Then the Israelites crossed over. For Joshua, the Jordan River continued to flow until the priests stepped into it. Seems like a small detail, but in a liberation story, small details carry big meaning. In just a few days, as Pastor Zigrid pointed out during our prayers together, this nation will observe Juneteenth. It's a holiday I didn't grow up learning much about in school, and I'm grateful that we know so much more now. It's the holiday that commemorates the emancipation of enslaved people in the U.S. Although the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1862, it was not until June 19, 1865, 3 full years later, that news of their freedom reached enslaved people in Texas. It was the last region to receive the news. 3 years. Among the countless Black men and women who fought tirelessly and courageously for generations to secure their freedom was Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman, as most of you know, was one of the most influential leaders of the Underground Railroad. She had escaped her own abuse of slaveholders in Maryland in 1849 and made her way to Philadelphia, but she returned to Maryland shortly thereafter to rescue her own family. Tubman worked with great secrecy and skill, building a tremendous network of help, serving as the conductor of the Underground Railroad for nearly 10 years. During that time, she made 13 trips to Maryland, personally bringing about 70 people to freedom, and she organized freedom for countless more. During every trip, Harriet Tubman risked her own recapture and surely her life. Tubman would go on to serve as a nurse for the Union Army in the Civil War, where she used her stealthy skills to gather information from across enemy lines. Her intelligence and bravery were precisely what the military needed. According to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, quote, on June 2nd, 1863, Harriet Tubman, under the command of Union Colonel James Montgomery, became the first woman to lead a major military operation in the United States, and she had 150 African American Union soldiers help her to rescue more than 700 slaves in Combahee Ferry raid during the Civil War. Tubman was known during all of this for her unwavering faith. She once said, "God's time is always near. He set the North Star in the heavens, he gave me the strength in my limbs, and he meant I should be set free." It seemed wherever God brought Harriet, she heard the call to set God's people free along with her, so much so that she was called the Moses of her people. If today's scripture is about Joshua, Why did I just spend so much time telling you about a woman compared to Moses? Because like Moses, Harriet left a legacy of leadership that many equally significant people would then follow. I see Tubman's influence in the life and work of Mary McLeod Bethune. During the Great Depression, when schooling and employment opportunities for Black women had become especially scarce, furthering the divide of inequality, Mary helped create educational and training programs to assist them. She helped guide them to a new financial freedom. Harriet Tubman's legacy reached forward in time to influence Martin Luther King Jr. and also Howard Thurman, the prominent Christian educator and theologian known for embracing MLK's radical nonviolent approach. He co-founded San Francisco's Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples, the first integrated religious congregation in the United States. He helped build a church and lead people of all races to a place of fellowship and worship where they were free to worship together. I see Harriet Tubman's influence in the entire civil rights movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, and every movement in this nation that has served to bring people to liberation and equality. What does it mean that in one story the waters parted before anyone went into the sea, and in the other the river only cleared when their priests put their feet into it? God has the power to work in all people and in all situations, but God works through all of them in different ways. There would be no Juneteenth, and decades later, no Mary Bethune or MLK or Howard Thurman without Harriet Tubman. And yet their stories are not the same. Moses and Joshua were both leading people from despair toward peace and freedom, but they were doing so at different times. So their people had different needs. Which brings us back to another very important detail in the Joshua text: the Ark of the Covenant. It was described as a large gold-plated box that contained stone tablets with the 10 commandments that God had spoken to Moses. The ark came before the people began their wilderness trek. It is considered a manifestation of God's presence. Joshua was leading a particularly weary group. They are at the end of a 40-year journey. In their weak and weary state, they were especially in need of some spiritual fuel, strength for that final push. They needed this reminder of God's presence. God parted the sea for Moses. God paused the roaring waters of the Jordan for Joshua. Different leaders, the same Holy One. And generations later, God knew that another leader would need an entirely different experience at that River Jordan. It is where a man named John would one day baptize his cousin, Jesus. And he would go on to lead a great many more people using the running waters of the Jordan that had once gone to carve a path to the promised land as a symbol of grace and ultimate freedom for all. And if that isn't enough to give you the holy goosebumps, let's really bring it full circle. The name Joshua in Hebrew is Yahushua, which means to rescue or deliver. The name Jesus in Hebrew is almost the exact same pronunciation, Yeshua, and it too means to rescue or deliver. We often talk about Jesus following Moses' legacy, but in Saturday school, Jesus would have learned the importance of Joshua's legacy, and it is one in which he followed. So let me say this in the most intellectual, theological terms I possibly can. Joshua's a big deal. Joshua's a big deal, and so are you. This is not a story about second strings or understudies at all. Because in God's story, there are no second string leaders. It is the good news that we are called to follow, and we are also called to lead. And that God will work through each of us in a way that is just right for us and for our people in our time, if we will allow God to do so. Step up to the riverbank. Too many people in this world are still searching for freedom. Let us see how God will still the waters for us.